Please don't start talking about your little business projects tonight, my husband said as he backed our black Audi SUV into his parents' circular driveway, the headlights sweeping across giant stone columns wrapped in Thanksgiving lights. Mom already thinks you make everything about yourself. I turned slowly in the passenger seat and stared at him, because for 1 second, I honestly thought I'd heard him wrong. My little projects? I asked quietly. Daniel kept his eyes on the windshield. You know what I mean, Elena. Just let tonight be easy for once. Then his phone buzzed through the speakers. His mother's name flashed across the dashboard screen. Cynthia Whitmore. Daniel answered immediately. We're here, he said. I could hear her voice crackling through the car speakers before he lowered the volume. Good. And Daniel? Please make sure Elena doesn't start one of her work conversations again. Your father already has enough stress with the merger situation. Daniel laughed softly under his breath. Laughed. Trust me, he said, glancing at me for half a second. That won't be a problem. Something inside my chest went painfully still after that. Not shattered, not dramatic, just quiet. Like a light switching off in a room nobody realized was occupied. If this story speaks to your heart, only if it truly resonates with you. I'd love for you to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. I always read them later at night when the world finally gets quiet. My name is Elena Morales. I'm 33 years old, and the Thanksgiving dinner at the Whitmore estate was the night I realized my husband had been embarrassed of me for years. It was also the night his entire family learned the truth about who they had been mocking across that dinner table. But that truth didn't begin inside that mansion. It started months earlier with a phone call I never told Daniel about. The Whitmore house looked like something from an East Coast luxury magazine spread. 3 stories of gray stone, warm amber lights glowing through 12-foot windows, fresh wreaths hanging from black iron lanterns. Expensive, perfect, cold. The smell of turkey and cinnamon hit me the second Daniel opened the front door. Voices echoed through the foyer. Crystal glasses clinked somewhere deeper inside the house. Cynthia Whitmore appeared almost instantly, wearing a cream cashmere dress and diamonds that caught the chandelier light every time she moved her head. She kissed Daniel's cheek first. Always Daniel first. Then she turned to me with that same tight smile she'd been giving me for 6 years. Elena, she said, looking me up and down slowly. No designer bag this year? I glanced at the small leather purse hanging from my shoulder. I guess not. Well, she sighed lightly, at least you look presentable. Daniel smirked as he took off his coat. Not a big reaction, just enough, just small enough to hurt worse. Behind Cynthia, his younger sister Vanessa walked by carrying wine glasses. Hey, Elena, she called casually, still doing consulting or whatever? Or whatever. I smiled politely because I'd spent years learning how to survive this family without showing them where the cuts landed. Something like that. Vanessa nodded like she'd already stopped listening. Dad's talking to some investors in the library, she said to Daniel. You should go in there. They're discussing the merger. Daniel immediately straightened a little. His entire posture changed. Seriously? Yeah, they flew in from New York this morning. Cynthia touched his arm proudly. Your father says this deal could completely save the company. Then her eyes shifted toward me again. Of course, people who work in real business understand how important opportunities like this are. There it was, the first cut of the night. Clean, precise, designed to sound accidental. I followed them farther into the house while servers carried trays of appetizers through the dining room. The television above the fireplace was muted on a financial news channel. Stock numbers crawled across the bottom of the screen in red and green. Daniel disappeared almost immediately into the library with his father and brother, leaving me standing beside the staircase holding my own coat. Nobody noticed. Nobody asked if I needed anything. I hung it up myself. In the kitchen, Cynthia directed staff while criticizing everything at the same time. No, the cranberry sauce goes beside the turkey, not behind it. Honestly, people don't think anymore. She looked over when I walked in. Elena, can you help bring out the gravy boats? I nodded automatically, even though there were already 2 catering assistants standing beside the counter. One of them looked confused when Cynthia handed me the tray. Careful, she added. Those are antique. 20 minutes later, everyone gathered around the long mahogany dining table while soft jazz played through hidden ceiling speakers. The seating arrangement told me everything I needed to know before anyone even spoke. Daniel sat beside his father near the head of the table where the business conversations happened. I was placed halfway down beside the teenagers and across from Cynthia. Again, the same spot every holiday. The safe spot. The irrelevant spot. Crystal glasses reflected candlelight across polished silverware, while conversation drifted toward investments, private schools, expansion plans, tax strategies. Every topic floated effortlessly around me like I wasn't sitting there at all. Then Cynthia lifted her wineglass slightly and smiled toward one of the investors sitting near Richard Whitmore. "I always admire women who know how to build something meaningful," she said. "Families, legacies, stability. Not everyone understands the value of that anymore." Her eyes landed directly on me. Vanessa smiled into her drink. Daniel didn't look up from his plate. I felt heat rise slowly behind my ribs, but I kept my face calm. Calm had become survival. "So, Elena," Richard finally asked while cutting into his turkey, "what exactly do you do these days?" Before I could answer, Daniel spoke first. "She mostly manages relationships." "Mostly." I turned my head slowly toward him. "Relationships?" I repeated softly. He shrugged without meeting my eyes. "You know what I mean." The entire table moved on before I could say another word. Just like that. Like my entire career could be summarized into something decorative and small enough not to threaten anyone in that room. My phone vibrated beside my plate. Once. Then again. Then a third time. I glanced down quickly. Martin Keller board chair. Underneath it. Urgent. Daniel noticed the screen for half a second. His expression tightened slightly. "You should probably silence that," he muttered. Across the table, Cynthia leaned back in her chair and smiled thinly. "Honestly, Elena, tonight would be much nicer if people could simply be present instead of pretending every email is life-changing." Everyone chuckled quietly. I reached over and turned my phone face down beside my napkin. But deep down, beneath the humiliation, beneath the exhaustion, beneath 6 years of swallowing comments exactly like these, one terrifying thought had already started forming in my head. Because if Martin Keller was calling me repeatedly during Thanksgiving dinner, then something had happened with the deal. And if something had happened with the deal, the Whitmores were about to find out exactly who I really was. The strange thing about humiliation is that it rarely starts with one big moment. Most of the time it starts with tiny things repeated so often you stop realizing they are cutting you at all. By the time dessert was served that Thanksgiving night, I already knew exactly how the rest of the evening would go, because I had lived versions of it for 6 straight years. Cynthia would make little comments disguised as concern. Vanessa would ask insulting questions with a smile on her face. Richard would talk over me whenever business came up. And Daniel would sit there pretending none of it was happening, because acknowledging it would force him to choose between me and the family names stitched into his entire identity. The dining room smelled like roasted rosemary, butter, and expensive candles that probably cost more than my first apartment rent in San Diego. Crystal glasses reflected soft gold light across the table, while everyone talked about markets, acquisitions, golf memberships, and private schools. I barely touched my food. "You are quiet tonight," Cynthia said while passing mashed potatoes toward one of the investors. "Usually people get defensive when they know they have not accomplished much." Vanessa laughed into her wineglass. "Mom." "What?" Cynthia shrugged. "I am trying to encourage honesty in this family." Daniel kept staring at his plate. I watched his jaw tighten slightly, but he still said nothing. Not one word. That hurt worse than Cynthia ever could. Because strangers can humiliate you once, family learns exactly where to place the knife. The worst part was that I used to believe if I worked hard enough, if I stayed patient enough, if I proved myself enough, eventually they would respect me. That belief had started years before I ever met Daniel Whitmore. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in East Los Angeles, where the walls rattled every time the industrial dryers downstairs kicked into high spin. My mother worked double shifts at a nursing home 6 days a week. My father disappeared before I turned 8. By 13, I was helping my mother translate medical bills, because her English was still shaky whenever legal language got complicated. "Read this one slowly," she would say at our tiny kitchen table while steam from instant rice fogged the windows. "Do they want more money?" I learned very early that money controlled the temperature of a room. People with money spoke slower, they interrupted less. Their mistakes sounded temporary. Everyone else apologized for existing. At 16, I got a part-time job answering phones at a small logistics company after school. The owner, Miss Hargrove, used to toss invoices onto my desk and say things like, "You are smart for a kid from this neighborhood." I remember the first time I stayed late helping him reorganize client spreadsheets because one of his managers quit unexpectedly. "You understand contracts?" he asked, surprised. "A little," I said. He stared at me for a second over his reading glasses. "Do not stay little." Nobody had ever said anything like that to me before. By college, I was juggling classes during the day and unpaid internships at night while other students talked about ski trips and spring break flights to Cabo. I used to sit in campus parking lots eating peanut butter crackers because they were cheap and filled you up fast. I graduated near the top of my class anyway. Then I entered corporate consulting, where I learned something even more important than strategy. I learned how wealthy families survive failure. They hide it behind confidence. That realization became the foundation of everything I built later. But when I met Daniel at 27, none of that seemed to matter anymore. Back then, he made me feel seen in a way I had never experienced before. We met at a fundraiser in Chicago during a rainstorm after the valet accidentally gave my umbrella away to another guest. Daniel offered me his jacket while we waited under the awning outside the hotel. "You look miserable," he said, smiling. "That obvious? Only to people who grew up pretending they were fine." I laughed harder than I should have. We stayed outside talking for almost an hour while taxis splashed rainwater along the curb. He told me about his family company. I told him I worked in strategic consulting. He looked impressed then, genuinely impressed. Or maybe I just wanted to believe he was. The first 2 years together were easy. Small apartment downtown, late-night takeout containers, shared Netflix passwords, grocery shopping at 11 at night because both of us worked too much. Daniel used to brag about me back then. "My girlfriend can negotiate anybody into anything," he would tell friends proudly. But everything started changing after Richard Whitmore offered him an executive role at the family company. Suddenly, every dinner became about appearances, about legacy, about status. Cynthia once looked directly at my work laptop sitting on their kitchen counter and asked, "Do you ever think about finding a softer career? Something more feminine?" I thought she was joking. She was not. Another time during Christmas brunch, Vanessa asked if I planned to keep working forever after marriage. "Consulting seems exhausting," she said while stirring cinnamon into her coffee. "I cannot imagine living like that." Daniel squeezed my hand under the table and whispered, "Just ignore her, ignore her." That became his answer to everything. Ignore the comments, ignore the disrespect, ignore my mother, ignore my sister, ignore the fact that they act like you are temporary. And slowly, almost without realizing it, I started becoming smaller around his family. Quieter, easier, less threatening. I stopped talking about major clients, stopped mentioning travel, stopped sharing wins. It felt easier than watching Cynthia's expression tighten every time someone praised me. But the truth was, while the Whitmores spent years assuming I was ordinary, I had quietly become the person companies called when billion-dollar negotiations started collapsing behind closed doors. None of them knew that. Not even Daniel fully understood. And sitting there at that Thanksgiving table while my phone kept vibrating beside my untouched plate, I suddenly realized something terrifying. Maybe I had hidden myself so well. Even my own husband had started believing the version of me his family invented. My phone vibrated again beneath the tablecloth, a sharp mechanical buzz against my thigh that felt louder than the conversation around me. I glanced down quickly while Cynthia argued with Richard about interest rates and holiday staffing bonuses. 3 missed calls from Martin Keller. 2 new emails marked urgent. My stomach tightened. Martin never called repeatedly unless something had shifted fast. Across the table, Daniel noticed my expression. "You are doing it again?" he said quietly without looking at me. "Doing what?" "Checking out mentally whenever work comes up." I stared at him for a second because the irony almost made me laugh. Work had always mattered to Daniel when it belonged to men in tailored suits sitting around polished conference tables. But when it was mine, it became a distraction, a hobby, an inconvenience. "Sorry," I said softly, slipping the phone back beside my napkin. Cynthia leaned back in her chair with that same graceful posture she somehow maintained even while criticizing people. "Honestly, Elena, I do not know how you survive that lifestyle. Constant emails, constant pressure. It seems exhausting for such little reward." Vanessa nodded immediately. "Exactly. That is why I switched out of corporate recruiting after like 8 months. I could never make work my whole personality. I almost said something then. Almost. But years of experience stopped me. The Whitmores did not ask questions because they wanted answers. They asked questions so they could hear themselves speak. Richard cut another piece of turkey and looked toward Daniel. Speaking of pressure, we might finally have movement on the Keller acquisition. My eyes lifted automatically, Daniel noticed. So did Richard. You know Keller Group? He asked casually. A little, I answered carefully. Well, Richard sighed. They have been dragging negotiations for months. Their board cannot decide anything. Nobody can even get direct access to Keller himself anymore. I lowered my wine glass slowly. That usually means the deal structure changed. Richard blinked once. Possibly. Cynthia smiled thinly. See? Elena always sounds impressive when she repeats business jargon. Vanessa laughed. Daniel smirked into his drink again. But Richard kept watching me now, just slightly more carefully than before, because I had been right. He did not know enough yet to understand why. The truth was, 3 years earlier I had walked away from a powerful consulting firm after one of the senior partners told me I was excellent in support roles, but too emotionally reserved for leadership visibility. I still remembered sitting in my car outside that office tower afterward, with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles hurt. Support roles, another polished phrase for stay smaller. 2 months later, I started Morales Strategic Advisory from a tiny rented office above a bakery downtown. 600 square feet, water-stained ceiling, folding desk from Office Depot. I built the company one impossible client at a time. Failing mergers, corporate disputes, leadership restructures nobody else could untangle quietly. At first, I handled everything myself. Contracts, presentations, negotiations, billing. I used to eat takeout noodles at midnight while reviewing acquisition terms under fluorescent office lights that buzzed constantly overhead. There were nights I slept on the couch in my office because I could not afford mistakes. And slowly, almost invisibly, companies started calling me directly. Not because I was loud, because I solved problems quietly. That became my reputation. She fixes things before they collapse, one CEO told another, then another, then another. By 32, I was consulting on deals worth more money than I had once believed existed outside movies. But none of that changed the Whitmores. If anything, success made them colder. The first time Daniel saw a financial magazine mention my company, he barely looked up from his laptop. "That is great, babe," he said distractedly. "Hey, can you order dinner?" Another night I came home after closing a difficult negotiation in Dallas that saved nearly 400 jobs at a manufacturing firm. I was exhausted but proud, genuinely proud. Daniel listened for maybe 30 seconds before interrupting me. "You know," he said while loosening his tie, "Mom thinks you work too much for someone who is not actually building equity anywhere." I stared at him. "My company is profitable." "I know. I am just saying maybe she has a point about balance." Balance, the word wealthy people use when they want ambitious women quieter. At the Thanksgiving table, Vanessa suddenly leaned toward me. "Wait," she said. "Is your company even big enough to have employees?" "Vanessa," Cynthia said lightly, pretending to scold her while smiling at the same time. "What? I am curious." "We have 12 people," I answered calmly. 12? Vanessa repeated, surprised. "Like full-time?" "Yes." She exchanged a look with Daniel that lasted maybe half a second too long. "Wow," she said slowly. "I honestly thought it was just freelance consulting." Daniel reached for his water glass. "It is still a relatively small operation." Something in my chest tightened again. Small operation. As if the past 3 years of sacrifice could be reduced to something temporary and decorative. Then my phone buzzed once more. This time, the screen lit bright enough for Richard to notice the name before I turned it over. Martin Keller. Richard froze mid-bite. "Martin Keller?" he repeated carefully. The entire table quieted just slightly. I kept my expression neutral. "We have worked together before." Richard set down his fork. "You know him personally?" Before I could answer, the television over the fireplace shifted from commercials back to financial coverage. Nobody paid attention at first except me. A red banner flashed across the bottom of the screen. Breaking market update. My pulse slowed in that strange way it always did, right before something major happened. Somewhere deep inside, instinct told me the night was about to change. And judging by the way my phone would not stop vibrating against the tablecloth, whatever was coming had already started. The room changed. The second Richard Whitmore heard Martin Keller's name. It was subtle at first, just a pause too long before he reached for his wineglass. A shift in posture, the kind of silence powerful people fall into when they suddenly realize someone at the table may know something they do not. "You worked with Keller Group?" Richard asked again, slower this time. I nodded once. "A few times." Vanessa let out a soft laugh. "Wait, Martin Keller, the billionaire?" "There are not many of them," I said quietly. Cynthia immediately smiled, that polished smile she used whenever she wanted to regain control of a conversation. "Elena exaggerates sometimes," she told the table lightly. "Consultants love making ordinary meetings sound important." My eyes moved toward Daniel automatically, waiting for him to correct her, waiting for him to say something simple like, "Actually, Elena works with major firms all the time." Instead, he took another sip of wine and stared down at his plate. That was the moment something inside me finally cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to understand the truth clearly for the first time. Daniel did not stay silent because he was uncomfortable. He stayed silent because agreeing with them benefited him. The successful Whitmore son with the simple, non-threatening wife. That version of our marriage fit neatly inside his family's world. The real version did not. Richard leaned back slowly. "Interesting," he muttered, "because Keller Group has blocked every outside negotiation attempt for nearly 6 months. Maybe they trusted the wrong people," I answered before I could stop myself. The table went quiet again. Cynthia's eyes narrowed immediately. That sounded personal. It was professional. Daniel finally looked at me then. "Elena." Just my name. A warning disguised as concern. I knew that tone. Do not embarrass me. Do not challenge my family. Do not become difficult. I pushed my fork gently against the edge of my plate. "What exactly have you been told about the merger?" Richard exchanged a glance with Daniel before answering carefully. "Enough to know it is critical for the company. And enough to know failure would be catastrophic," Daniel added. I looked at him steadily. "Then maybe you should ask why negotiations kept stalling." Vanessa laughed softly again. "God, you sound like one of those people on business podcasts." Cynthia smirked. "Elena likes sounding important." The investors near the head of the table chuckled politely. One of them, an older man with silver cufflinks, looked toward me curiously. "What line of consulting are you in exactly?" Before I could answer, Daniel jumped in. "Mostly relationship management and strategic support." Strategic support. There it was again. Smaller words. Safer words. He was editing me down in real time right in front of strangers. "Support?" I repeated slowly. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "You know what I mean." No. I realized suddenly, I did not know what he meant anymore. Because the man sitting beside his father now looked nothing like the person who once stood outside with me in the rain talking about dreams and ambition and building a life together. This Daniel watched his mother humiliate me and translated my career into softer language so nobody at the table would feel threatened. My phone buzzed again. This time, the vibration seemed impossibly loud against the polished wood table. Richard looked directly at the screen before I could turn it over. "Why is Martin Keller calling you during Thanksgiving dinner?" he asked bluntly. Every conversation stopped completely. Even the football game muted in the background suddenly felt too loud. I kept my voice calm. "Because I told him not to call unless something changed tonight." Vanessa blinked. "Changed with what?" I hesitated for half a second too long. Cynthia noticed immediately. "Elena," she said sweetly, "please do not start pretending you are somehow involved in this acquisition. Richard has spent months working on it." There it was, the trap hidden beneath the smile. Pretend. The entire family already believed the story Cynthia had spent years building about me. The ambitious little outsider trying too hard to seem impressive. And Daniel had allowed it to grow, because correcting them would force him to admit his wife had become more influential than anyone expected. More influential than him. "Nobody is pretending," I said quietly. Cynthia gave a short laugh and looked around the table. "Do you see what I mean? This is exactly what happens whenever Elena feels insecure. Everything suddenly becomes about her." Several people nodded politely. One investor even smiled sympathetically toward Daniel like he was dealing with an exhausting spouse. I felt heat rush into my face so suddenly it almost made me dizzy. Not because I doubted myself, Because I realized they genuinely believed her. Years of comments. Years of small humiliations repeated carefully enough to become accepted truth. Difficult, defensive, oversensitive, attention-seeking. Cynthia had built that version of me brick by brick, while Daniel stood beside her holding the cement. "Mom," Daniel said finally, but his voice carried no real objection. "Maybe let us just enjoy dinner," Cynthia sighed dramatically. "I am trying to, but every holiday turns into this strange performance where Elena needs everyone to think she is secretly running Wall Street." A few people laughed harder this time. I looked directly at Daniel. "Are you seriously okay with this?" For a second, something flickered across his face. Guilt maybe, discomfort, then it disappeared. "You are overreacting," he said quietly. Overreacting. The word landed harder than every insult before it. Because suddenly, I understood the real betrayal was never Cynthia. It was the man beside me watching his family slowly erase me piece by piece while calling it peacekeeping. My phone rang again. This time the sound cut sharply through the entire dining room. Martin Keller. Richard stared at the screen. Daniel stared at the screen. Everybody stared at the screen. And before I could silence it, the television above the fireplace switched abruptly from football coverage to a red breaking news banner that made Richard Whitmore go completely pale. The entire dining room froze beneath the glow of the chandelier, while the red breaking news banner stretched across the television screen above the fireplace. Nobody moved at first. Even the clink of silverware stopped. Richard Whitmore stood up so quickly his chair scraped hard against the hardwood floor. "Turn that up," he snapped. One of the teenagers grabbed the remote with shaky hands. The volume rose slowly, filling the room with the calm, polished voice of a financial news anchor. Tonight, Keller Group officially finalized its $480 million acquisition agreement after nearly 11 months of stalled negotiations. Richard stared at the screen without blinking. Daniel looked confused beside him. Cynthia crossed her arms tightly like she already sensed something she did not like approaching. The anchor continued speaking while footage of downtown Chicago skyscrapers rolled behind her. Sources inside the board described the negotiations as one of the most difficult strategic restructures this year, led primarily by independent advisor Elena Morales. My name echoed through the room so clearly it almost did not sound real. Vanessa's wine glass stopped halfway to her lips. One of the investors whispered, "Wait. What?" The screen shifted to a photo taken 6 months earlier outside a corporate conference in New York. Me standing beside Martin Keller in a navy coat, holding briefing documents against my chest while cameras flashed around us. Richard's face drained of color. Daniel turned toward me slowly, like he was seeing a stranger sitting in his mother's dining room. Cynthia laughed once under her breath. Sharp. Nervous. "That cannot be right." Nobody answered her. The anchor kept talking. Industry insiders say Morales played a critical role in restructuring investor confidence after internal negotiations collapsed earlier this year. Richard finally spoke. "You were leading the Keller deal?" I kept my voice steady. "Yes." The silence afterward felt physically heavy. Daniel stared at me. "You told me you were consulting." "I was." "Elena," he said quietly, "this is not consulting, this is—" He stopped because he did not know what word to use anymore. Important, powerful, necessary. None of those words fit the version of me his family spent years creating. Cynthia straightened immediately, slipping back into control mode so fast it almost impressed me. "Well," she said with a tight smile, "why would you hide something like this from family?" I looked at her carefully. "You never asked." Vanessa shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Richard sat back down slowly without taking his eyes off me. "Our company has been trying to access Keller Group for months," he admitted. "You knew that?" "Yes." "And you said nothing?" Daniel asked. There it was. Not pride. Not support. Accusation. Like my silence had somehow betrayed him instead of the other way around. I stared at him for a long second before answering. "Every time I tried talking about work tonight, your family mocked me." Cynthia immediately shook her head. "Oh, please, Elena. Do not make this dramatic." Dramatic. That word again. The room suddenly felt too warm. I could smell burnt sugar from the sweet potatoes cooling near the centerpieces. The candles had started melting unevenly down silver holders. Tiny, ordinary details while my marriage quietly collapsed across a Thanksgiving table. My phone rang again. Martin Keller. This time Richard looked almost nervous. You should answer that, he said immediately. Hours earlier, he barely acknowledged me. Now his voice carried careful respect. I stood slowly and stepped away from the table toward the hallway near the library. The entire room watched me go. I answered on the fourth ring. Martin. Finally, he exhaled sharply. I have been trying to reach you for 30 minutes. I was at dinner. Well, your phone is about to explode. The press release went live early after CNBC leaked the acquisition numbers. I leaned against the hallway wall and closed my eyes briefly. I saw. You also need to know something else, he said carefully. Keller Holdings approved the regional partnership expansion tonight. My stomach tightened instantly. Already? Unanimous vote. Effective immediately. I said nothing for a second because I understood exactly what that meant. Richard Whitmore's company had spent nearly a year desperately chasing access to that expansion. Without it, their manufacturing division would likely lose major investor support within 12 months. Martin lowered his voice slightly. Your recommendation carried the vote, Elena. Down the hallway, I could still hear muffled conversation inside the dining room. Cynthia speaking too quickly. Vanessa whispering questions. Daniel silent. Are you there? Martin asked. Yes. Congratulations, you earned this. Earned. Such a simple word. But hearing it after years inside the Whitmore family felt strangely painful, because suddenly I realized how starving I had become for basic recognition. Thank you, I said quietly. You should celebrate tonight. I looked back toward the dining room entrance where Daniel had finally appeared in the doorway watching me from across the hall. His face looked pale now, unsteady. I do not think I feel much like celebrating. After I ended the call, Daniel walked toward me slowly. Why did you never tell me? He asked. I laughed softly before I could stop myself, not because anything was funny, because the question itself felt unbelievable. I tried, I said, for years. He rubbed his hand across the back of his neck. No, I mean all of this. The deal, the board, the expansion. Would it have mattered? His expression tightened. Of course it would. Really? I looked directly at him. Because 30 minutes ago your mother called me a failure while you sat there smiling into your wine glass. He looked down immediately, guilt finally reaching him too late. Elena, do you know what the worst part is? I asked quietly. I kept thinking eventually you would defend me. Every holiday, every comment, every insult. I kept waiting for the moment you would choose me over keeping the peace. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Back inside the dining room, Cynthia suddenly called loudly toward the hallway. Elena, sweetheart, come back in here. We should all talk properly. Sweetheart, the word made my chest ache, because now that they understood my value, suddenly they remembered how to be kind. I looked at Daniel standing in front of me beneath the soft hallway lights and realized something devastating. The loneliness I felt in that moment was heavier than every insult that came before it, because humiliation hurts. But discovering the people closest to you only respect power changes something permanent inside you. The drive home felt longer than usual, even though the roads were almost empty. Rain tapped softly against the windshield while downtown Chicago glowed in blurred streaks of gold and white beyond the highway barriers. Daniel kept both hands locked on the steering wheel the entire time, like he was afraid touching anything else might break it. Neither of us turned on the radio. Neither of us spoke for almost 20 minutes. The silence between us no longer felt temporary. It felt furnished, lived in, like something that had been quietly growing for years while I pretended not to see it. My phone kept vibrating in the cup holder beside me. Emails, text messages, unknown numbers. One message from Vanessa read, I honestly did not know, Elena. Another from Cynthia arrived 3 minutes later. I hope you understand nobody meant to upset you tonight. The wording almost made me laugh. Nobody meant to upset you. As if humiliation simply floated into rooms by accident like dust in sunlight. Daniel finally cleared his throat as we stopped at a red light near the river. Mom was embarrassed. I turned slowly toward him. Your mother was embarrassed? He exhaled hard through his nose. That is not what I meant. Then what did you mean? He tightened his grip on the wheel again. Tonight got out of control. I stared at him for several seconds because suddenly I understood something painful. Even now, after everything, Daniel still viewed the problem as the dinner becoming uncomfortable. Not the years of disrespect underneath it. Not the way he helped shape it every single time he stayed silent. Do you know what I kept thinking while everyone laughed at me tonight? I asked quietly. He glanced at me briefly but said nothing. I kept thinking if I disappeared tomorrow, your family would probably describe me as difficult before they described me as kind. The traffic light turned green. Daniel drove forward slowly. That is not fair. No, I said softly. It is not. We reached our condo just after midnight, 24th floor, glass walls overlooking the city. The kind of apartment Daniel once called proof we were building a beautiful life together. Tonight, it felt strangely temporary, like a furnished hotel room where two exhausted strangers happened to share a lease. The second we walked inside, Daniel's phone started ringing. Richard. He ignored it once, then twice. On the third call, he answered with a tired sigh. Dad. I walked quietly into the kitchen while he listened. The marble countertops still held unopened mail and a half-empty bottle of sparkling water from that morning. Ordinary life sitting untouched, while something enormous cracked open underneath it. Daniel lowered his voice, but I could still hear enough. No, I did not know. Pause, because she never told me. Another pause. Longer this time. Dad, I understand the situation. Situation. Such a clean corporate word for emotional collapse. I opened the refrigerator mostly to avoid listening. Cold air spilled across my face, smelling faintly like lemons and leftover takeout containers. Behind me, Daniel's voice sharpened slightly. I said I will talk to her. I closed the refrigerator without taking anything. When he finally hung up, the apartment felt painfully quiet again. Daniel stood near the kitchen island, loosening his tie slowly. My father wants to meet with you tomorrow. I leaned against the counter. About the expansion? Yes. No. He blinked. No, I am not discussing business tomorrow. Elena, this is serious. I looked at him steadily. It became serious to your family exactly 1 hour after they realized I was useful. His expression tightened with frustration now. Can you stop acting like they are villains? The words landed harder than he intended. I could see it immediately in his face afterward, but he still said them. Villains? I repeated quietly. Daniel, your mother called me a failure in front of 20 people. She did not mean it literally. I laughed once under my breath, tired, hollow. That somehow makes it worse. He ran both hands through his hair and paced toward the windows overlooking the city. I just do not understand why you hid all this from me. There it was again, the same question, as if my silence existed in a vacuum separate from the environment that created it. Do you remember Dallas? I asked suddenly. He frowned. What? The manufacturing restructuring 2 years ago. Vaguely. Of course he remembered vaguely. I remembered everything. I called you after the board approved my recommendation, I said softly. I was standing outside the hotel crying because 400 employees were keeping their jobs. Daniel stayed quiet. You said you could not talk because your mother was upset about seating arrangements for Easter brunch. His eyes dropped immediately. Elena, another time I made the cover of Midwest Business Monthly, and your sister joked that they must have been desperate for women in leadership that year. I swallowed carefully before continuing. You laughed. The apartment went still after that, not angry, not explosive, just painfully honest. Daniel sank slowly onto one of the bar stools at the kitchen island and stared down at his hands. For the first time all night, he looked less defensive and more tired, human. I did not realize it was hurting you that much, he admitted quietly. That sentence hurt more than everything else combined. Because how do you explain to someone that the deepest loneliness is being unseen by the person sleeping beside you every night? I looked out through the windows at the Chicago skyline glowing beyond the rain. Thousands of lights scattered across dark glass towers. Somewhere inside one of those buildings, people were probably still celebrating the deal that changed my career forever. But standing in my own kitchen beside my own husband, I had never felt more alone in my life. My phone buzzed softly again against the marble counter. This time, it was not Martin Keller, or CNBC, or investors. It was my mother. A simple text message. Mija, I saw you on television. I am proud of you. I stared at the screen for a long moment, while something tight inside my chest finally loosened just slightly. Not healed, not fixed, just enough to breathe again. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise without setting an alarm. Chicago was still dark outside the bedroom windows, the skyline reduced to scattered lights floating through fog and rain. For a few seconds I forgot everything that happened at Thanksgiving dinner. Then I rolled over and saw Daniel asleep beside me, one arm stretched across the empty space between us, and the weight in my chest returned immediately. Quiet, heavy, familiar now. I slipped out of bed carefully and walked into the kitchen wearing one of Daniel's old college sweatshirts. The marble floor felt cold beneath my feet. My phone already held 37 unread emails, 12 voicemail notifications, 3 interview requests from financial media outlets, and 1 message from Martin Keller sent at 5:12 that morning. Proud of you. We should discuss next steps Monday. Next steps. The words sat in my chest differently now. Not like pressure, like possibility. Behind me, I heard Daniel enter the kitchen. "You are awake early," he said quietly. I nodded while pouring coffee into a mug. The smell filled the room immediately, dark and bitter. Could not sleep. He stood there for a second like he wanted to say something meaningful but could not figure out where to start. "Dad still wants to meet with you," he finally said. I kept my eyes on the coffee. "I know. He is serious about the expansion partnership." "So am I." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck again, a nervous habit I had once found endearing. Now it mostly made me tired. "Mom called me 3 times after we got home." "I am sure she did. She feels bad." I looked up then. "Does she feel bad because she hurt me or because she embarrassed herself?" Daniel opened his mouth, closed it again. That answer told me enough. By Monday morning, I was back in my downtown office for the first time in nearly a week. Morales Strategic Advisory occupied the 22nd floor of a renovated brick building overlooking the river. Not flashy, not oversized. Just clean glass walls, warm lighting, and a reception desk built from reclaimed oak because I liked things that survived reinvention. Jasmine looked up from the front desk the second I walked in. "There she is," she grinned, "our accidental celebrity." I laughed softly for the first time in days. "Please do not start. Too late. CNBC already called twice this morning." She handed me a stack of printed messages clipped together neatly. "And someone sent flowers." White orchids sat beside the conference room windows with a handwritten card tucked into the arrangement. "Congratulations on finally getting the recognition you deserve." No signature. I stared at the card for several seconds before setting it down quietly. "You okay?" Jasmine asked. "Yeah, but I was not." Because praise after years of dismissal can feel strangely painful too, like your nervous system no longer knows what to trust. Inside the conference room, my team was already preparing for Monday strategy meetings. Laptops open, coffee cups scattered across the table, financial projections glowing across screens. Marcus looked up immediately. "We just got confirmation. 3 new firms requested consultations after the Keller announcement." 3? Actually 4. Priya corrected while typing quickly. "One from Boston came in 20 minutes ago." Marcus leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Looks like you finally broke the internet for corporate restructuring." I smiled faintly but said nothing. Then Priya glanced at me more carefully. "You look exhausted." I sat down slowly at the head of the table. "Family holiday." The entire room groaned knowingly. Marcus pointed toward me with his coffee cup. "See? That is why I only see my cousins on Zoom." Small laughter filled the room. Easy, warm. Nobody here needed me smaller to feel comfortable themselves. That realization settled quietly inside me throughout the morning, while meetings blurred one into another. Contracts, expansion calls, investor briefings, real work. By noon, the Whitmores had already started reaching out again. First Richard, then Vanessa, then finally Cynthia herself. Her voicemail arrived at 12:43. "Elena, sweetheart, I think we all misunderstood each other Thursday night. I would really love for us to sit down properly." Properly. Interesting how respect always arrives after usefulness becomes visible. Daniel texted around 1 o'clock. "Mom wants to host dinner next week." Just immediate repositioning, like the family narrative had changed overnight and everybody was scrambling to rewrite their roles inside it. I did not answer any of them. Instead, I spent the afternoon inside conference rooms reviewing expansion timelines while cold November sunlight stretched across the city outside the windows. Around 4:30, Marcus stepped into my office doorway, holding a tablet. "You need to see this." He handed it over. An industry publication had just released a feature article online. The headline sat across the screen in bold letters: "The quiet negotiator behind this year's biggest deal." Underneath it was my photo, leaving a board meeting in Manhattan 6 months earlier. Calm expression, black wool coat, focused eyes. I stared at the article longer than I expected. "That photo is terrible," I muttered finally. Marcus laughed. "You know what I mean." I did, because for the first time in years, people were seeing me clearly, not as someone's wife, not as a polite accessory at family dinners, not as a smaller version designed to make other people comfortable. Just me. Around 6 that evening, I finally left the office carrying my laptop bag through the crowded lobby downstairs. Outside, the air smelled like snow and car exhaust. Chicago traffic crawled through wet streets, while Christmas lights flickered across storefront windows. My phone buzzed again as I waited at the crosswalk. Daniel. I almost ignored it. Almost. But something made me answer. "Hey," he said carefully. "Hey." A long silence stretched between us, filled only by distant sirens and passing buses. Then his voice softened slightly. "I do not think I have said this enough, Elena, but I really am proud of you." I closed my eyes briefly against the cold wind, because 6 years ago those words would have meant everything to me. Now they arrived sounding late, not fake, just late. "Thank you," I said quietly. Across the street, the traffic light changed from red to green. People started moving around me toward glowing office towers and crowded restaurants, and lives still unfolding. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder and stepped forward into the crosswalk, feeling something unfamiliar, slowly returning beneath all the hurt. Not revenge, not anger, direction. And somewhere, deep down, for the first time in a very long time, I had this strange feeling that my real life might finally be beginning. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, I stood in front of a ballroom filled with nearly 400 executives, while a giant LED screen behind me displayed the words Global Strategic Leadership Summit across moving blue graphics. The conference hotel overlooked Lake Michigan, all polished marble floors and floor-to-ceiling glass, reflecting winter sunlight across crowds of people carrying leather portfolios and conference badges. Mine hung around my neck from a navy lanyard with a silver title card beneath it, Elena Morals, Founder and Chief Strategy Officer. I stared at the badge for a second while waiting backstage, because something about seeing the words printed so plainly still felt unreal sometimes. Not the title itself. The fact that I finally believed I deserved it. 5 minutes, a stage coordinator told me while adjusting her headset microphone. I nodded and took another sip of water. Around me, assistants rushed between curtains holding tablets and printed schedules. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the backstage hallway, mixed with expensive perfume and cold winter air every time the side doors opened. My phone buzzed quietly in my blazer pocket. "Daniel." I let it ring twice before answering. "Hey." His voice sounded careful again these days, softer, like every conversation now carried invisible glass between us. "I saw your interview this morning." "Which one?" "Bloomberg." I smiled faintly. "There have been a few." A pause stretched briefly between us. "You looked confident." The hesitation in his voice almost hurt more than criticism used to, like he was still adjusting to the reality that other people saw value in me so easily, while he spent years overlooking it inside our own apartment. "Thank you," I said quietly. "Are you nervous about the keynote?" "A little." "You will be great." Another silence followed, not hostile anymore, just unfamiliar. Since Thanksgiving, something fundamental had shifted between us. Daniel had started noticing things he used to ignore. The way people greeted me at events, the calls I took at midnight from CEOs in different time zones, the fact that my calendar filled months in advance. He noticed now because suddenly the rest of the world was reflecting me back to him clearly enough that he could no longer pretend not to see it. But recognition arriving late creates strange damage. Some things do not fully grow back once neglected too long. "I should go," I said softly. "They are about to start." "Okay." He hesitated again before adding, "I really am trying, Elena." I closed my eyes briefly. "I know." After we hung up, I slipped the phone back into my pocket and walked toward the stage entrance where giant screens displayed scrolling sponsor logos above rows of seated executives. Men in tailored suits, women in sharp blazers, venture capital firms, manufacturing groups, international banking representatives, the kind of room Cynthia Whitmore once implied I would never belong in. Funny how life works. "You ready?" Marcus asked beside me, straightening his tie. He had flown in that morning with 2 members of my leadership team. "As ready as I will ever be," he grinned. "Good, Because there are 3 Fortune 500 companies in that audience trying to hire you after this speech. I laughed under my breath. That sounds exhausting. That sounds expensive, he corrected. The ballroom lights dimmed slowly as music faded through the speakers. A moderator walked onto the stage, introducing the keynote panel, while applause rippled through the crowd. Then my name appeared across the massive screens behind the podium in white letters, nearly 6 feet tall. Elena Morales, Chief Strategy Officer, Morales, Strategic Advisory. The audience applauded politely while I stepped into the stage lights. For one strange second, I remembered sitting at the Whitmore Thanksgiving table holding a gravy boat, while Cynthia explained to strangers that I lacked direction in life. The memory no longer burned the same way. It just felt distant now. Small. "Good afternoon," I said into the microphone, my voice steady across the ballroom speakers. Most failed negotiations are not actually about money. They are about ego, fear, and people refusing to admit they no longer understand the room they are standing in. A few people nodded immediately. Pens moved across notebooks. Somewhere near the front row, a woman smiled slightly, like she understood exactly what I meant beneath the business language. I spoke for 40 minutes without notes, about leadership, about restructuring broken systems before they collapse publicly, about learning to stay calm while everyone else panics. Real stories, real strategy, real experience built from years nobody bothered asking about. Afterward, the applause lasted longer than I expected. Bright flashes from phones and cameras flickered across the ballroom, while executives lined up near the stage wanting introductions, meetings, conversations. One gray-haired investor shook my hand firmly and said, "You are exactly who our company has been looking for." Another woman from a New York equity firm smiled while handing me her card. "Your reputation is becoming impossible to ignore." Impossible to ignore. The phrase followed me through the afternoon while conference staff escorted me toward a private networking lounge overlooking the lake. Outside the windows, snow had started falling lightly over the Chicago skyline, soft white flakes drifting between glass towers and traffic below. My conference badge swung gently against my blazer as I walked past mirrored walls and crowded tables full of executives discussing markets and acquisitions. For the first time in years, I did not feel like I was borrowing space inside rooms like this. I belonged there, not because someone invited me, because I built my way into it myself. As I reached for another coffee near the lounge entrance, my phone buzzed again. This time it was not Daniel. It was Richard Whitmore. I stared at the screen while snow continued falling outside the windows. Then slowly, after letting it ring 3 full times, I answered. "Elena," Richard said immediately, his voice unusually serious. "I think we need to talk about what happens next." And just like that, everything connected back to Thanksgiving night all over again. Richard Whitmore asked me to meet him 3 days before Christmas at the downtown headquarters of Whitmore Industrial Holdings. Not his house, not a restaurant, not somewhere warm or personal. His office. That alone told me the conversation was not about family anymore. Snow covered the sidewalks in uneven gray piles as I stepped out of the elevator onto the 42nd floor that morning. The lobby smelled faintly like espresso and expensive wood polish, while soft instrumental music drifted through hidden speakers overhead. 2 receptionists looked up immediately when I entered. One of them smiled politely. "Good morning, Miss Morales. Mr. Whitmore is expecting you." Miss Morales. Funny how quickly titles change once people understand your value. I followed the assistant down a long hallway lined with framed photographs of factories, shipping facilities, ribbon cuttings, and decades of carefully curated Whitmore success. Richard stood near the windows when I entered his office, hands clasped behind his back while snow fell softly beyond the glass skyline. He looked older than he had at Thanksgiving, not physically fragile, just tired in a way powerful men rarely allow themselves to appear. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. I placed my leather portfolio on one of the chairs but stayed standing. "You said it was important." He nodded once toward the conference table. "Sit down, Elena." For a second, the room felt strangely familiar. Men in tailored suits, floor-to-ceiling windows, financial reports spread across polished wood. The kind of room I had spent years building a career inside, while Daniel's family kept pretending I worked on little projects. Richard slid a thick folder across the table toward me. "These are the latest numbers from our manufacturing division." I opened the folder slowly. Revenue projections, investor concerns, debt exposure reports. The deeper I read, the quieter the room seemed to become. "This is worse than I expected," I admitted finally. Richard sat across from me, removing his glasses slowly. "We lost 2 major investors last quarter. Because of the stalled expansion?" "Partly." He hesitated before continuing. "The board has become nervous." I looked back down at the numbers. Nervous was a polite word for what I was seeing. "How long have you known it was this unstable?" Richard rubbed his jaw tiredly. "Long enough." Outside the office windows, snow drifted sideways between skyscrapers while traffic crawled below like slow rivers of light. Somewhere deeper inside the building, I could hear muffled office phones ringing and printers running. Normal business sounds surrounding quiet desperation. "Daniel does not know how serious this is, does he?" I asked. Richard stayed silent for a moment too long. "No." That answer sat heavily between us. "Why are you showing me this?" He looked directly at me then. "Because whether my family deserves it or not, you may be the only person capable of helping us stabilize this company." There it was. Finally. Honest. No polished manipulation. No fake compliments. Just the truth sitting plainly in the middle of the table. I leaned back slowly in my chair. "Your wife spent 6 years convincing everyone I was insignificant." Richard lowered his eyes briefly. "I know. And Daniel let her. I know that too." The honesty almost caught me off guard. He sighed quietly and looked toward the windows again. "Cynthia grew up believing status was survival. She measures people by visibility, wealth, connections. It is not an excuse, but it explains some things. It does not explain Daniel." Richard nodded once like he expected that answer. "No," he admitted softly. "It does not." My phone buzzed gently against the conference table. "Daniel." I silenced it without answering. Richard noticed immediately. "Things are difficult between you two." It was not really a question. "Things are honest now," I replied. He looked at me carefully after that, like he was trying to understand something too late. "You know," he said slowly, "when Daniel first brought you home years ago, Cynthia told me she worried you were too ambitious." I let out a quiet breath through my nose. Of course she did. I disagreed with her. I looked up. "That surprised me enough to show slightly on my face," Richard noticed. "You reminded me of myself at 30, he said. "Hungry, focused, calm under pressure." He gave a tired half smile. "Frankly, I underestimated how threatened my family would become by that." Threatened. Such an important word. Because suddenly so many years started making sense in ways they never fully had before. The comments, the dismissals, the way every achievement of mine somehow became awkward at family dinners. It was never really about me being unimpressive. It was about me becoming harder to control. A soft knock interrupted the room before I could answer. Richard's assistant stepped inside carefully. "Sorry to interrupt, sir, but the board members are arriving early." Richard checked his watch immediately. "Already?" "Weather delays downtown. Most came straight from the airport." He stood slowly and closed the folder in front of me. "I need to ask you something difficult, Elena." The tension in his voice shifted the entire room instantly. "What?" He hesitated. For the first time since I met him, Richard Whitmore looked uncertain. "The board meeting today is about emergency restructuring." My chest tightened slightly. "Okay." "And several people inside this company believe the only reason Keller Holdings approved the regional partnership was because of your direct involvement." I said nothing. Snow continued falling outside the windows, while footsteps and distant voices echoed through the hallway beyond the office doors. Richard's expression grew heavier. "There is something else you need to know before you decide whether you are willing to help us." He reached slowly into the folder again and pulled out a document I had never seen before. Then he slid it across the table toward me, just as voices from the boardroom started approaching the hallway outside. The boardroom stayed silent for several seconds after Richard finished speaking. Snow drifted slowly beyond the 42nd floor windows, while 12 executives sat frozen around the long walnut conference table staring at me like they were trying to recalculate an equation they had misunderstood for years. The document Richard slid toward me explained everything. Months earlier, during the final stages of the Keller negotiations, Whitmore Industrial Holdings had quietly been flagged as financially unstable by 2 institutional review groups. Keller Holdings planned to walk away from the partnership entirely. The only reason they reconsidered was because I personally guaranteed operational restructuring oversight through Morales Strategic Advisory. My name sat across the final recommendation pages in black ink beside signatures from 3 Keller board members. I remembered that night clearly now. Manhattan, 2:30 in the morning, empty conference room, Martin Keller loosening his tie while staring at risk assessment reports spread across glass tables. I do not trust Whitmore leadership anymore, he admitted bluntly back then. Their internal numbers are unstable. The company can still recover, I told him, only with different operational strategy. Martin looked at me carefully for a long moment before asking the question that changed everything. And are you personally willing to oversee that process? I said yes without ever telling Daniel. Sitting in the boardroom now, I realized how differently the Whitmores would have treated me if they had known all along that their future survival partially rested in my hands. The thought no longer made me angry, just tired. One of the board members cleared his throat first. So, to be clear, he asked Richard carefully, the Keller partnership exists because Miss Morales vouched for us directly? Richard nodded once. Yes. Another silence followed immediately. Then everything changed. Why was this never disclosed internally? Someone demanded. Because Keller requested confidentiality during negotiations, Richard answered sharply. And because, another executive added while looking directly at me now, we apparently underestimated who we were dealing with. I stayed calm in my chair even while every eye in the room shifted toward me differently now. Respect feels strange when it arrives from the same people who once dismissed you. It carries a certain sadness underneath it. Daniel entered the boardroom halfway through the discussion. The second he walked in, the tension shifted again. He stopped near the doorway after noticing me sitting beside Richard. What is going on? Richard removed his glasses slowly. Sit down. Daniel looked confused but obeyed. His eyes moved between the documents spread across the table and the faces around him. Dad? One of the executives answered before Richard could. Your wife may have saved this company. Daniel turned toward me immediately. The room stayed quiet while realization moved slowly across his face piece by piece. Not surprise anymore. Something heavier. Regret, maybe. You knew all this? He asked softly. Most of it. And you never told me? I looked at him steadily across the table. Would you have listened? That landed harder than anything else said that morning. Daniel looked down immediately. Nobody else in the room spoke. They did not need to. The truth had already filled every inch of the space between us. Cynthia arrived 20 minutes later, wearing a cream wool coat dusted lightly with melting snow. The moment she walked into the boardroom and saw me seated beside Richard, her expression tightened almost invisibly. I came as soon as Daniel called, she said carefully. Nobody stood to greet her. Nobody rushed to fill her in. The power in the room had shifted too far already. Richard gestured toward the empty seat near him. Sit down, Cynthia. She glanced around slowly before lowering herself into the chair. What exactly is happening? Richard slid the Keller documents across the table toward her. Read. The room remained silent except for the faint rustling of paper while Cynthia read page after page. I watched the exact moment she understood. Her posture stiffened. Her breathing slowed. She looked up at me slowly across the conference table, like she no longer recognized the woman she spent years underestimating at holiday dinners. You were overseeing the restructuring? She asked quietly. Yes. And Keller Holdings approved the expansion because of you? Partly. Cynthia stared at the papers another second before finally setting them down carefully. I see. It was the first truly honest thing I had ever heard her say. No sarcasm, no performance, just acknowledgement. But even then, something inside me stayed distant, because apologies lose power when respect only appears after status becomes undeniable. Daniel shifted beside her, his voice quieter now. Elena, why did you keep carrying all this alone? I looked toward the snowy skyline outside the windows before answering. Because every time I tried sharing parts of myself with this family, they treated me like I was performing, instead of speaking honestly. Nobody interrupted me this time. Eventually, I continued softly, it became easier to stay quiet. Cynthia lowered her eyes briefly. I owe you an apology. The sentence sounded difficult for her to say. Almost unfamiliar. You owe me more than one, I answered calmly. The room went still again, not hostile, just honest in a way families rarely are. Cynthia swallowed carefully before speaking again. You are right. I nodded once but felt no victory from hearing it. That surprised me more than anything. For years I imagined moments like this would feel satisfying, vindicating. Instead, it mostly felt sad, because no amount of professional success can fully undo the loneliness of spending years unseen inside your own marriage. Richard finally leaned forward, folding his hands together. The board wants Morales Strategic Advisory to lead the restructuring process officially. Several executives nodded immediately. We are prepared to move quickly, one added. Full authority if necessary. Full authority. The words settled quietly into the room while snow continued falling beyond the glass towers outside. Months ago, these same people would not have known my name. Now they were offering me control over the future of Whitmore Industrial Holdings. I looked at the documents spread across the conference table, then at Daniel, sitting silently beside his mother. He looked exhausted now, older somehow, like the consequences of years spent avoiding difficult truths had finally caught up to him all at once. I will consider it, I said finally. Cynthia looked up immediately. Elena. I raised my hand gently, stopping her before she could continue. If I agree to help this company, I said calmly, there will need to be boundaries. Nobody argued. Professional boundaries, personal boundaries, and very clear expectations moving forward. Richard nodded slowly. That is fair. Fair, another interesting word, because fairness arriving after years of imbalance does not erase what came before. It only reveals how long the imbalance existed. The meeting continued after that, but emotionally something still remained unresolved inside me. The Whitmores finally understood my value now. The problem was, I was no longer sure I wanted their approval anymore. By the time spring arrived in Chicago, the city no longer felt as cold to me as it once had. The snow disappeared slowly from the sidewalks outside our building, replaced by rain, construction noise, and little patches of green pushing through the edges of downtown parks. Life kept moving the way it always does after painful things happen, quietly. Without asking whether your heart is ready to catch up, Morales Strategic Advisory officially took over the restructuring process for Whitmore Industrial Holdings in February. I agreed under one condition. Everything would remain strictly professional. Clear reporting structures, independent oversight, no family interference. Richard accepted immediately. Cynthia did not argue either. That part surprised me the most. Something about that boardroom meeting changed her. Not overnight, not magically, but enough. The sharp little comments disappeared. The constant comparisons stopped. Sometimes growth does not look dramatic. Sometimes it is simply a person realizing they no longer have the right to diminish someone else. Daniel and I started therapy 2 months after Thanksgiving. Not because everything suddenly became fixable, because for the first time, both of us were finally honest enough to see the damage clearly. Some sessions ended quietly. Some ended with long drives home where neither of us spoke. There were nights I slept facing the opposite side of the bed, wondering whether love could survive years of being unseen. There were also mornings when Daniel reached for my hand in the kitchen, while coffee brewed, and I saw genuine remorse in his face instead of defensiveness. Healing is strange like that. It rarely arrives in one grand moment. It comes in fragments, in pauses, in people learning how to tell the truth before resentment hardens permanently. One Friday evening in April, I stayed late at the office reviewing restructuring reports, while sunset turned the windows gold around me. The conference rooms were mostly empty by then. Cleaning crews moved quietly through the hallway. Somewhere downstairs, a security guard laughed at something on his phone. Ordinary sounds, peaceful sounds. My assistant Jasmine knocked softly on the glass door before stepping inside. "You are still here?" she asked. "Unfortunately." She smiled and placed a small package on my desk. "This came for you." After she left, I opened the box carefully. Inside was the old silver serving spoon from Thanksgiving dinner. The antique one Cynthia made such a big deal about when she asked me to carry gravy to the table, while everyone else discussed real business. Beneath it sat a handwritten note in Cynthia's careful script. I spent years teaching people to measure worth by status instead of character. I think I finally understand the difference now. "Thank you for helping this family, even after we failed you." I stared at the note for a very long time, not because it erased the past. It did not. Some wounds become part of you permanently, but acknowledgement matters. Accountability matters. Sometimes people change just enough to stop repeating the harm they once normalized. And sometimes that is the closest thing to closure we get. A few weeks later, Daniel and I walked along the Chicago River after dinner, while boats moved slowly through dark water below the bridges. The air smelled like rain and city pavement cooling after heat. "Do you ever wish Thanksgiving never happened?" he asked quietly. I thought about it carefully before answering. "No." He looked surprised. I slipped my hands into the pockets of my coat. "I wish it had not hurt so much," I admitted, "but I think I needed to see the truth clearly." Daniel nodded slowly beside me. "About my family?" "About myself." We stopped near the railing overlooking the river where lights reflected across the water in long broken lines. "For years," I said softly, "I kept shrinking parts of myself because I thought making other people comfortable would make me lovable." Daniel looked down immediately. "Elena, I am not saying that to punish you," I continued gently. "I am saying it because I finally understand something now." I rested my arms against the cold metal railing while wind moved softly through my hair. "The people who truly love you do not require you to become smaller so they can feel bigger." Neither of us spoke after that for a while. We just stood there listening to the city move around us. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang softly through the evening air. Cars passed overhead. Water shifted below the bridge. Life continuing. That is the thing nobody tells you about betrayal or humiliation or heartbreak. Surviving it does not suddenly make you fearless. It just teaches you where your boundaries should have been all along. Looking back now, I do not think the worst part was being underestimated. The worst part was how long I participated in my own silence, because I thought peace was more important than honesty. If you are listening to my story tonight while sitting in a relationship, a family, or a room where people constantly make you feel small, please hear me carefully when I say this. Your intuition usually notices disrespect long before your mind is ready to admit it. Pay attention to patterns. Pay attention to how people speak to you when they think you have nothing they need. Protect your finances. Protect your confidence. Protect the version of yourself that still believes you deserve kindness. Because once you start abandoning your own voice to keep other people comfortable, you slowly disappear inside your own life. And no promotion, no marriage, no amount of external success can heal that for you. I also believe something else now too. I think God, or the universe, or whatever greater force guides us through painful seasons, sometimes allows uncomfortable truths to surface, because hidden wounds cannot heal in darkness forever. Thanksgiving shattered something inside me, but it also returned something I did not realize I had lost. Myself. My name is Elena Morales. I am 33 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never let anyone convince you that your value becomes real only after they finally recognize it. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. Truly. If parts of it felt painfully familiar, I hope you know you are not weak for feeling hurt, and you are not difficult for wanting respect. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stop apologizing for taking up space in rooms they worked hard to enter. And if this story brought you comfort tonight, even quietly, I hope you will leave a comment, share your thoughts, subscribe to the channel, and stay for the next stories waiting in this playlist. There are more people out there carrying invisible heartbreak than we realize. Maybe hearing each other is one way we heal a little less alone. Because sometimes the stories that stay with us the longest are not about revenge or winning. They are about finally seeing ourselves clearly after years of standing in the shadows.